Joshua Maddux. This is one of the first cases I ever covered, but I knew very little about what I was trying to do with this channel or even how to edit, so I pulled it a while ago. It felt like I wasn't doing this case justice. Personally, I don't think it was fair to rule it an accident. You tell me what you think. It was 1990 and Joshua Maddux had just graduated from high school. He had an artistic side and he was working on a comic strip that he had named Stickman and Smiley. He was quick-witted and fun to be around. But because he was social and he was an adult, he didn't always come back home. So no one really thought anything of it when he told his family goodbye that day, took off for a walk. His family just thought he was staying with friends. His father began calling around and trying to find him, and he eventually reported him missing. Unfortunately, months would turn into years. His sister admitted she had a fantasy that he would just show up someday, with a wife and kids, and the truth wouldn't be known for 7 years. When Josh disappeared, he was planning a trip with his friend. The other man's name was Andy Newman. In fact, he'd been hanging out with Andy a lot lately, and many tips would be called in later, saying he'd been with Andy and Andy was a problem. There was something others found off about Andy Newman. Well, after Josh went missing, Andy did in fact travel to Albuquerque as planned. Apparently, Andy didn't have trouble making friends, and he befriended a caretaker of a disabled man that lived there. And the man left Andy with him alone while he went to go take a shower. When the caretaker came back out of the shower, the disabled man had been stabbed to death, and Andy was nowhere to be seen. Andy eventually ended up arrested in June of 2009 for the stabbing death of the disabled man. At the time of his arrest, Newman confessed to also murdering a young woman in Taos, New Mexico. He claimed that he stuffed the body in a barrel, and the strange thing is, it appears they did find the woman in a barrel. There was no revisiting that crime. They had a man in custody, and that was the end of that. Shockingly, the only witness to Newman's crime, the caretaker of the disabled man, passed away suddenly. And just like that, all the charges against Andy were completely dropped for that death. Despite the 2 confessions, he was a free man. Andy would experience arrest after arrest. They stem from criminal mischief to murder. It does appear, though, that many of the charges against him were unsuccessful. It was 7 years later when a man named Mark Murphy began demolishing an old cabin on his property, which was 2 blocks away from where Joshua lived. And inside, they found Joshua's remains, inside of the chimney.
Body found in the chimney of an abandoned cabin in Woodland Park. The coroner's office confirms it is a man who disappeared 7 years ago. Construction crews found the remains of Joshua Maddux in the chimney as they were preparing to demolish it. Investigators say Maddux may have been trying to shimmy down that chimney and got stuck. Joshua was 18 when he disappeared. His family is devastated by the news, but grateful for closure.
The people that owned the cabin had purchased it in 1950, but no one had resided there since 2005, which was 3 years before Josh went missing. After that, it was a storage facility of sorts and was rarely visited. Now here's where I have a problem with this case. The police ruled it an accident. The basic facts in this case are that the weather was 20 degrees. Josh had no clothes on from his waist down when he was found inside of the chimney. His pants and his clothing were folded inside the cabin, which may or may not have been unlocked. The toxicology report showed that Josh was not on drugs. The police originally claimed that Josh was trying to break into the cabin, and this was why he was inside the chimney. But then it's pointed out that his clothing was inside, so that doesn't work. They pivoted, and then they said he entered the fireplace from the roof because he couldn't get into the fireplace from the bottom and the inside, because the breakfast bar was in front. This assumes that he really wanted to be in that chimney. But why? Why would he even enter from the bottom? The other thing is there were all kinds of sharp edges inside of that chimney. And he had no clothes on. And if there was no one else there, he obviously had no plan of getting out. Why would he want to starve to death in a chimney or freeze to death? The owner of the cabin and his brother were the last occupants who lived there. A large breakfast bar in the room attached to the wall was dislodged and put in front of the fireplace. And they're clear, they did not move that breakfast bar. Also, not all that long before, the cabin owner had a heavy metal grate welded on the top of the fireplace so that animals couldn't drop inside. Yet Josh was inside, and there were no tools found on the top of the roof. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the chimney had been demolished and removed before they realized Joshua was inside, so it's possible that great moving tools had been there and they were taken. The owner said he believes somebody removed the rebar in order to insert him in there. He fit it with rebar and large mesh that hung from steel hooks. That said, it seems incredulous to me that this was ruled an accident. The police did acknowledge that the heavy wooden breakfast bar had been ripped from the wall. But rather than questioning who moved that and why, they simply suggested its location is then what stopped Josh from entering the chimney from inside. However, they stopped short of trying to explain why they felt he needed to enter the chimney at all. Half naked, in the middle of winter, knowing he couldn't get out. When they found him, it appeared his knees had been pushed together, face down. So he was in kind of a fetal position inside of that chimney, which I would think would make him wedged even harder. I know if I entered a hole on purpose, I can't imagine going head first. And their way means he looked in the bottom of the chimney inside. He had to know he wasn't getting out if he couldn't get in. Yet this was still concluded an accident. Prior to Josh disappearing, he had not gotten in any kinds of trouble. He'd had no mental health problems. He wasn't on drugs. In fact, he'd never been into drugs at all. His only problem that he had was that his older brother, Zachary, had committed suicide 2 years before. But Josh, by all accounts, he was doing pretty well. The coroner stated the hard tissue showed no outward signs of trauma, and there were no drugs. He described it as very confusing. He said that if Josh was alive when he entered the chimney, it was most certainly not an instant death, but then went on to say that it's only speculation. The speculation was that it could be hypothermia or dehydration. Too much time had passed for them to tell a whole lot. And I checked. The day he disappeared, the high outside was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Without pants, it would have been even colder. The owner of the cabin, Chuck Murphy, has been consistently vocal that he found the conclusion of accidental death ludicrous. The owner said he believes somebody removed the rebar in order to insert him in there. The cabin owner wasn't quiet about it either. He was clear that he and his brother did not move that bar in front of the chimney, and it was a really heavy bar that had been attached. They said not only was it securely adhered to the wall, it was so heavy it would be hard to move, and it would likely take 2 people. He cannot see a reason for anyone removing it randomly and shoving it in front of the fireplace, especially given that its location is the reason that he didn't smell the decomposing body on the times that he'd come into the cabin. The coroner considered the location of the bar important too. It was him who suggested that this was what caused him to enter from the roof, because he was unable to enter from inside. A lot of people seem to have this theory, and they kept tossing it around. He didn't even try to guess why Josh would want to enter in the first place. This is why the story is so disturbing to me, because there's no question that this just seems ridiculous. There was a quick grasping of the easiest conclusion that required the least amount of work, not the most logical. It was leaked that the coroner, prior to this ruling, was overheard stating that he believed it would have taken 2 people to put Josh in the fireplace. And since there aren't 2 suspects, he concluded that couldn't have happened. The coroner later made a statement saying that this one really taxed our brains. We found his clothing just outside the firebox. He had on only a thermal t-shirt. We don't know why he took his clothes off, but his shoes and his socks were off also when he went inside. And then he went outside, climbed on the roof, and went down the chimney. It's not linear thinking, he said. He said the most plausible explanation is that it's an accident, and as such, that's their conclusion. The cabin owner was very loud, completely disagreed, and he made so much noise that they opened it up again. He was saying to anyone who's listening that there's no way that guy crawled outside that chimney with that steel webbing. He didn't come down the chimney. Coroner Al Bourne admitted they got a lot of tips about what might have happened to Josh, and a lot of them included Andy. One witness came forward to say that Andy was bragging about having put Josh in a hole. Just 3 days after the original ruling, Bourne surprisingly reopened the case then, conceding to Murphy's statements that it wasn't an accident. Then, despite admitting the circumstances were odd, he quickly turned around and closed it again, insisting Josh had tried to descend the chimney himself. So, just as quickly as it was reopened, it was closed again. Several of Josh's friends came forward to say that they saw Andy Newman with Josh. They begged the police to question Andy about the disappearance, but there's no indication that he was ever questioned, and Newman was in jail in Texas at the time. He could have been questioned by them. It appears Newman has been taken into custody many times since then. One of the times he got arrested, police ran his prints when he was caught with some underage kids, and they found that he was wanted in Seattle for burglary. By the time of that arrest in Texas County, he had arrest records in 6 states. His last arrest seems to be out of Florida for violation of parole in 2018, and he's no longer being held at that facility. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. Please take a moment and hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Take care of yourselves and each other.